The moment she slammed into my ranch gate, she stopped calling it a shortcut and started calling her insurance company. The metallic crack rolled across the pasture before the echo reached my porch. I looked up from my coffee just in time to see a cloud of Texas dust drifting through the morning sun, followed by the hiss of a luxury SUV that had finally discovered the one thing it couldn't bully. White steam curled from beneath the hood. One front wheel sat at an angle that didn't look expensive until you realized everything attached to it probably was. Linda Crawford threw open her driver's door so hard it bounced back toward her shoulder. "You trapped me," she screamed before her boots even touched the gravel. Her voice carried across 80 acres like it owned every inch of them. I set my coffee mug down on the porch rail, walked toward the gate at the same steady pace I'd used every morning for the past 12 years, and stopped a few feet away from the bright yellow warning sign she'd driven past without reading. I looked at the twisted front end of her Mercedes, then at the steel ranch gate standing exactly where it had been designed to stand. "No," I said quietly. I protected my property. The smell of hot coolant mixed with fresh cedar fence posts and damp morning grass. Somewhere behind me, my horses barely bothered to lift their heads from the hay. They'd heard this woman yelling often enough that it no longer meant anything. The sheriff's dispatcher answered my call before Linda finished threatening to sue me. "Morning, Ethan," she said. "Everything all right?" I glanced toward the security camera mounted above the entrance. Its tiny green light blinked steadily in the early sunlight. "Morning, Carol. I'd like to report another trespassing incident. This one's a little more expensive than the last few." Linda froze. Not because of my words, but because she finally noticed the camera, the reflective warning signs, the fresh survey stakes, and the thick concrete footings that disappeared beneath the ground on both sides of the gate. She looked around as if all of it had appeared overnight. It hadn't. Every bolt, every weld, every inch of reinforced steel had been installed legally, inspected properly, and documented carefully. Nothing about this morning was an accident. 3 months earlier, I would have believed it was. 3 months earlier, I still thought neighbors respected fences, locked gates meant private property, and common sense was enough to solve simple problems. I was wrong on all 3 counts. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, born and raised outside Bandera, Texas, where people wave from pickup trucks, fix their own fences, and understand that a closed ranch gate isn't a suggestion. My grandfather built this entrance with his own hands in 1964 after returning from a lifetime of working cattle across hill country. My father replaced the cedar posts after a storm in the late 80s. When it became my ranch, I rebuilt the hinges but kept the original iron latch because it still carried the tiny hammer marks my grandfather left behind. Every sunrise began with the same familiar sound. Steel, chain, latch, gate. It wasn't just an entrance. It was the heartbeat of our family land. Then Linda Crawford decided it was her shortcut. She lived at the edge of the neighboring subdivision, president of the Willow Creek HOA, proud owner of a spotless white Mercedes, and an even shinier opinion about everyone else's property. According to her, driving through my ranch saved almost 6 minutes on the way to the country club. According to county records, it was still private land. Funny how only one of those facts mattered in court. Back then, though, I hadn't realized I was watching the beginning of a lesson that would eventually cost her $68,000. And the strangest part is, she had every chance to avoid it. 80 acres looks peaceful from a distance, but every acre carries somebody's fingerprints. Mine happened to carry 3 generations of my family's work. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought this ranch with money he saved 1 calf at a time after returning home in the early 1960s. He never believed in borrowing more than he could repay or promising more than he could deliver. He believed in fences that stood straight, gates that closed properly, and handshakes that meant something. My father inherited the same habits. By the time the ranch became mine, every corner of the property held a memory that could not be measured in dollars. The old windmill still groaned whenever the south wind picked up. The weathered barns still smelled like cedar, leather, motor oil, and fresh hay after every summer rain. Even the gravel driveway had its own rhythm beneath truck tires, a sound I could recognize before sunrise without looking out the window. I had spent most of my adult life working as a certified structural welder before returning home full-time after my father retired. Steel paid the bills. The ranch reminded me why I earned them in the first place. Every winter, I repaired fences. Every spring, I checked water lines. Every summer, I rebuilt equipment that most people would have hauled to the scrapyard. If something broke, I fixed it. If something leaned, I straightened it. My grandfather used to tell me that neglect always starts with something small. Leave one loose hinge alone long enough, and eventually the whole gate ends up lying in the dirt. I thought he was talking about hardware. Years later, I realized he was talking about people. The entrance to my ranch sat beside a county road that eventually curved toward Willow Creek Estates, one of those carefully planned subdivisions where every mailbox matched and every front lawn looked like it had been trimmed with a ruler. Our properties touched at one corner, but that did not make my private entrance part of their neighborhood. The county survey was clear. The deed was clear. The steel sign beside the gate was clear. Private ranch. No public access. Even the reflective markers installed by the county pointed traffic toward the public road instead of my driveway. Most people understood that immediately. Delivery drivers turned around if they made a mistake. Hunters asked permission before entering. Utility crews called ahead whenever they needed access. Respect was never complicated. Then Linda Crawford became president of the Homeowners Association. She had a polished smile that always looked ready for a real estate brochure and a way of speaking that made ordinary requests sound like official orders. Her white Mercedes was spotless every day, even after driving dusty back roads. And somehow she always seemed to be in a hurry despite spending half her mornings telling everyone else how they should manage their property. The first time I saw her cut across my entrance, I honestly assumed she had taken a wrong turn. She rolled down her window, smiled, waved casually, and drove through before I could even walk over. I shrugged it off. Everybody makes mistakes. A week later, she did it again. Then again 2 days after that. Soon I noticed tire tracks crossing the same stretch of gravel almost every morning just after 8 o'clock. Fresh tread marks. Fresh dust hanging in the air. The chain on my gate swaying gently long after her sport utility vehicle disappeared toward the subdivision. It was always the same pattern. She slowed down just enough to push the gate open with her bumper, drove through without stopping, and left it hanging wide open behind her. That might not sound like much until you own livestock. An open ranch gate is never just an open ranch gate. It is an invitation for expensive problems. Every evening, I walked back down to close it again, listening to the hinges creak while wondering why someone with a perfectly paved public road insisted on pretending my driveway belonged to her. At that point, I still believed a simple conversation could solve everything. I had no idea I was about to discover how expensive arrogance could become when it refuses to recognize a property line. The conversation happened on a Thursday morning while the smell of fresh-cut hay still drifted across the pasture. Linda pulled through my gate like she had every right to be there, stopped beside my equipment shed, and lowered her window with the same polished smile she used at neighborhood meetings. "Morning, Ethan," she called as if we were old friends. "You really should leave this gate open. Everybody is using this route now." I rested one arm on the cedar fence and looked at the dust settling behind her expensive sport utility vehicle. "Linda, this is private property." She laughed softly, almost like I had told her a harmless joke. "Private property that connects perfectly to our subdivision. You are making things difficult for no reason." I pointed toward the county road less than half a mile away. "That road is public. This ranch is not." She shrugged, shifted into drive, and disappeared across my land without another word. I remember standing there listening to the fading sound of her tires crunching across gravel, thinking stubbornness had just introduced itself. Over the next few weeks, the pattern spread faster than weeds after a spring rain. First it was Linda, then another white sport utility vehicle with an HOA parking sticker. After that came landscaping trailers, delivery vans, real estate clients following her through the entrance, and even golf carts carrying people who waved as though they had been invited. Every afternoon, fresh tire tracks crossed the same section of gravel. The gate chain rattled so often that I could tell someone had come through without even looking outside. The hinges never had time to rest. Dust floated across my front porch almost every morning, coating the railings with a thin layer of pale brown powder that had not been there before. My border collie, Scout, started barking every time unfamiliar engines echoed through the valley. The horses grew used to unexpected traffic, but I never did. One Saturday, I found 2 families parked beside my pond taking photographs because someone had apparently told them the ranch was part of a scenic community trail. They apologized immediately after I explained they were on private land. One of them even showed me an online neighborhood discussion where somebody had described my driveway as the quickest connection between the subdivision and the county highway. Nobody had bothered to ask me if that information was true. They simply trusted the person who posted it. I had a pretty good idea who that person was. A few days later, I attended an open homeowners association meeting because several neighbors encouraged me to clear up the misunderstanding. The clubhouse smelled like fresh coffee, lemon furniture polish, and brand new carpet. Framed community awards covered the walls while Linda stood at the front greeting everyone like the mayor of a small town. When I politely explained that my ranch entrance was not available for public traffic, she smiled without missing a beat. "Ethan, we are simply encouraging neighborly cooperation. Your road saves everyone time." Several people nodded without realizing they were discussing land they did not own. I reached into my folder, unfolded a county survey, and placed it on the table. "This is my recorded property line. The entrance has always been private." Linda barely glanced at the map before sliding it back toward me. Paperwork does not always reflect practical community needs. A few people chuckled. Someone in the back joked that one cowboy should not control an easier route for an entire neighborhood. The room filled with light laughter while I quietly folded my survey back into its envelope. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody threatened anyone. Yet I walked out with the strange feeling that common sense had become the least valuable thing in the building. As I stepped outside, the warm Texas breeze carried the smell of fresh asphalt from a nearby construction project, and I watched Linda climb into her spotless Mercedes with complete confidence. She genuinely believed enough repeated shortcuts could eventually become entitlement. She did not realize every unnecessary trip through my gate was leaving behind something far more valuable than tire tracks. It was leaving behind a pattern, and patterns have a way of becoming evidence when someone finally decides to pay close attention. After that meeting, I made myself one simple promise. I was not going to match arrogance with anger. I was going to answer every unreasonable move with patience. The next morning, I replaced the faded private ranch sign with a brand new reflective aluminum one large enough to read from 200 feet away. I installed another sign beneath it that read "No through traffic." I painted fresh white boundary posts along both sides of the entrance and cleared away the tall grass so nothing blocked the view. The smell of fresh paint mixed with warm cedar as the afternoon sun baked the fence line. I stepped back, looked at the entrance, and thought even the most distracted driver could not possibly miss those warnings. Linda drove through less than 24 hours later without touching her brakes. The chain rattled against the steel post as her sport utility vehicle nudged the gate open just enough to squeeze past. She glanced at the new signs, smiled through the windshield, and continued across my driveway as if they had been placed there purely for decoration. I could actually hear the loose latch swinging behind her long after the engine disappeared beyond the hill. That evening, I closed the gate again and noticed fresh scratches along the lower frame where her front bumper had been pushing instead of waiting for someone to open it properly. They were small marks, but they did not belong there. Neither did the growing feeling that courtesy had completely left the conversation. I decided to document everything before emotions could cloud the facts. I photographed the gate every evening. I noted dates and approximate times in a notebook that normally held cattle feed records and equipment maintenance schedules. The pages slowly filled with neat handwriting instead of fertilizer calculations. Monday, 8:15 in the morning. White Mercedes entered property. Tuesday, 8:12. White sport utility vehicle exited through ranch. Thursday, landscaping trailer followed. Friday, delivery van used private drive. It felt almost ridiculous at first, but my grandfather always believed written records outlasted arguments. The following week, I mailed Linda a certified letter. It was polite, short, and impossible to misunderstand. I explained that the entrance was privately owned, that repeated unauthorized access needed to stop immediately, and that I expected future visitors from the subdivision to remain on public roads. I even enclosed a copy of the county survey showing the property boundary. 5 days later, another envelope appeared inside my mailbox. The paper smelled faintly of fresh printer ink and carried the Willow Creek Homeowners Association letterhead across the top. According to Linda, my gate created unnecessary inconvenience for neighborhood residents and emergency access concerns for community traffic. She encouraged me to consider cooperating with surrounding property owners in the spirit of good neighbor relations. I read the letter twice before laughing quietly to myself. Community traffic. There was no community road on my land. There never had been. Yet somehow the language transformed my private entrance into a public inconvenience. A few afternoons later, I found Linda standing beside the gate talking with two contractors wearing subdivision badges. She pointed toward my driveway while gesturing across the pasture with broad, confident movements. When she noticed me walking over, she greeted me with that same polished smile. "We are discussing possible improvements for traffic flow," she said. I looked at the contractors. "Gentlemen, this discussion ends here. You are standing on private property." Both men apologized immediately and stepped back toward their truck. Linda folded her arms. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be," I answered calmly. "Respecting a property line has never been difficult." Her smile disappeared for only a second before returning even brighter than before. "We will see about that." She climbed into her Mercedes, drove through the gate once again, and disappeared in another cloud of pale Texas dust. I watched the dust settle over the fresh paint on my fence posts and realized something important. This was no longer about saving 6 minutes on the way to the country club. It had become a contest of pride. Linda expected me to become frustrated enough to overreact. Instead, every letter, every photograph, every scratch on the steel, and every unnecessary trip through that gate quietly became another piece of a story that was beginning to tell itself. She thought repeated behavior would eventually normalize trespassing. I was beginning to understand that repeated behavior could also establish a very different kind of record. That was the day I stopped trying to convince Linda she was wrong and started proving it instead. Every morning before sunrise, I poured a cup of black coffee, stepped onto the porch, and listened. The ranch always woke up in the same order. First, the windmill groaned softly against the breeze. Then the cattle shifted across the pasture. Songbirds settled onto the fence posts just before daylight painted the cedar trees gold. A few minutes later came the sound that did not belong. Tires on gravel. The steady crunch echoed through the entrance long before I could actually see the vehicle. Sometimes it was Linda. Sometimes it was another resident from Willow Creek Estates following the exact path she had normalized. I never chased them anymore. I simply reached for the notebook waiting beside my coffee mug. Date, time, vehicle description, direction of travel, weather conditions. It became part of my daily routine with the same quiet discipline I used when maintaining tractors or checking water lines. Before long, the notebook was almost full. I decided handwritten notes were no longer enough. One Saturday, I drove into Bandera and visited a local security company owned by a retired deputy named Frank Collins. The showroom smelled like fresh wiring, cardboard boxes, and machine oil. Frank listened without interrupting while I explained everything that had been happening. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and nodded once. "People behave differently when they think nobody is documenting them," he said. "The truth usually starts with a camera." By the following Tuesday, for weatherproof cameras overlooked every angle of the entrance. One captured license plates. Another covered the gate itself. A third recorded the driveway from above, and the last faced back toward the county road. Each one stored high-resolution footage with automatic timestamps backed up to secure cloud storage. There was nothing hidden about them. Small reflective stickers clearly announced that video recording was in progress. Linda drove through anyway before lunchtime. She glanced directly at one of the cameras, smiled, and continued across my driveway as though recording only applied to everyone else. That confidence fascinated me more than it frustrated me. Most people become cautious when they know their actions are being documented. Linda seemed almost encouraged by it. Over the next several weeks, I reviewed every recording at night after finishing ranch work. The soft hum of my computer replaced the evening chorus of crickets while video after video played across the screen. Patterns began appearing that I had never noticed before. Linda rarely drove alone anymore. Real estate clients followed her through my entrance during weekend home tours. Contractors copied her route after watching her use it. Delivery trucks entered because another vehicle had already opened the gate ahead of them. The shortcut had quietly transformed into an unofficial roadway simply because one person acted as though permission already existed. I printed still images showing vehicles entering beneath clearly visible warning signs. Every photograph displayed the same bright yellow notice, the same boundary markers, and the same locked gate being pushed open anyway. I organized everything into dated folders. Video clips, photographs, certified mail receipts, property surveys, copies of county maps, even weather reports for the days major incidents occurred. Years of welding had taught me something valuable. A strong structure depends on preparation nobody notices. The finished product only looks effortless because someone measured everything before striking the first arc. Around that same time, I scheduled a meeting with Sheriff Daniel Brooks, whom I had known for years through county livestock programs. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper files. I spread the photographs across his desk without adding any emotion to the story. He studied each one carefully before looking up at me. "You have done the right thing so far," he said. "Keep documenting. Do not escalate. Property owners have every right to secure private entrances as long as everything complies with county regulations and proper notice is provided." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Secure private entrances. I repeated those words while driving past my own gate. I was no longer thinking about stopping Linda. I was thinking about improving the entrance exactly the way any responsible ranch owner would. The old hinges had served my family well for decades, but they had never been designed to handle daily abuse from vehicles treating them like automatic barriers. Standing there that evening with the smell of fresh-cut cedar drifting across the pasture, I ran one hand along the worn steel frame and noticed something I had ignored for weeks. Tiny stress lines surrounded the mounting plates. The gate had not failed yet, but it was warning me. My grandfather always said steel tells the truth if you know where to look. As I traced those faint marks with my fingertips, an idea quietly began taking shape, and unlike every argument that had come before it, this one would be built entirely out of patience, engineering, and the law. The following Monday, I parked my welding truck beside the entrance just after sunrise. The cool morning air carried the smell of damp earth, fresh coffee, and hot steel as I unloaded tools that had been part of my trade for nearly 20 years. There was nothing mysterious about what I planned to do. The old gate had reached the end of its service life after months of being forced open by vehicles that treated it like public infrastructure instead of private property. If a hinge wears out, you replace it. If steel begins to fatigue, you rebuild it. That is not revenge. That is maintenance. Before touching a single bolt, I called the county building office one more time to confirm I did not need any special permit for replacing an existing ranch gate with one that exceeded commercial strength standards while remaining inside my own property line. The answer was exactly what I expected. As long as the structure remained on my land, met setback requirements, and did not obstruct the county road, I was free to improve my entrance however I wished. I thanked the inspector, wrote down the date and time of the conversation, and added another page to my growing folder. Then I called Frank Collins from the security company. By noon, his crew had upgraded every camera to capture even clearer images of the entrance. One additional camera overlooked the warning signs from the opposite direction, so there could never be any question about what a driver could see before reaching the gate. The small monitor inside my office displayed every angle in real time. It felt less like surveillance and more like a permanent witness that never forgot details. Over the next several days, my ranch slowly transformed into a construction site. Sparks danced across the concrete floor inside my workshop as I cut thick steel tubing to length with my plasma cutter. The familiar smell of heated metal mixed with the sharp scent of cutting oil, while bright orange light reflected across the old photographs hanging on the wall. I reused the original iron latch that my grandfather had forged decades earlier, polishing it until the worn edges gleamed again. Everything else became stronger. Heavier hinges, reinforced mounting plates, internal gussets, a frame designed to resist years of ordinary ranch work instead of repeated abuse from impatient drivers. Every weld received the same careful attention I would have given a commercial bridge railing. Measure twice. Weld once. Grind smooth. Inspect everything. By Friday, the concrete crew arrived to replace the aging footings. Fresh concrete filled oversized forms anchored several feet below the frost line with reinforced steel extending deep into the ground. The wet cement smelled clean in the morning sun, while finishing tools scraped gently across the surface. Nobody was building a trap. We were building durability. Once the concrete cured, I installed reflective markers, fresh boundary posts, and a larger warning sign with bold black lettering that could be read from well beyond the county road. Private property. Authorized vehicles only. Do not enter. I even added reflective tape across the gate itself, so it remained visible before sunrise and long after sunset. Nothing about the entrance relied on surprise. In fact, it became more obvious than it had ever been before. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stopped by one afternoon after hearing I was rebuilding the entrance. He climbed out of his pickup truck, adjusted his hat against the afternoon breeze, and slowly walked around the finished structure. He tapped one of the heavy steel posts with his knuckles and smiled. "Looks like it will outlast both of us," he said. I smiled back. "That is the idea." He glanced toward the warning signs and nodded with approval. Nobody can honestly claim they did not know this was private. Those words stayed with me. Nobody can honestly claim they did not know. That evening I closed the gate for the first time after the installation. The new hinges moved almost silently despite the additional weight. The latch settled into place with one clean metallic click that sounded deeper and stronger than the old one ever had. I stood there for several seconds listening as the breeze moved through the live oak trees beyond the fence line. Everything felt solid again. Order had quietly returned to the entrance my grandfather built all those years ago. The cameras recorded. The signs reflected the fading sunlight. The reinforced gate stood exactly where it belonged. All that remained was waiting to see whether someone would finally choose respect over convenience. Deep down, however, I already knew which choice Linda Crawford was going to make. 3 mornings passed without a single vehicle crossing my property, and for a brief moment I wondered if common sense had finally won. The ranch settled back into its familiar rhythm. The gate opened only when I needed it. The hinges moved with a deep, solid whisper instead of the tired squeak they used to make. Scout stopped barking every few hours because there were no unexpected engines climbing the driveway. Even the dust seemed lighter now that traffic belonged where it was supposed to belong, out on the county road. Then Saturday arrived. The weather was clear, the kind of bright Texas morning that makes every piece of steel shine against a blue sky. I was repairing a section of fence about 100 yards from the entrance when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive sport utility vehicle turning off the pavement. Gravel popped beneath oversized tires. The engine note stayed steady instead of slowing down. I wiped my hands on an old shop towel and looked toward the gate. Linda's white Mercedes appeared exactly where I expected it would. She slowed for only a second. Through the windshield, I could see her looking directly at the new warning signs. The reflective lettering flashed in the sunlight. Private property. Authorized vehicles only. Do not enter. The bright yellow marker beneath it warned that the gate remained locked except for approved access. She had every opportunity to stop. Instead, she smiled. Even from that distance, I recognized the expression. It was the same confident smile she wore at homeowners association meetings whenever someone questioned her decisions. She eased closer until the front bumper nearly touched the gate. For one hopeful second, I thought she might finally back up and use the public road. Then the engine revved slightly. Not loudly, just enough to tell me she had already decided what would happen next. She expected the gate to swing inward the way the old one always had after months of being pushed aside. It did not. A sharp metallic sound echoed across the pasture, followed by the muffled thump of an airbag deploying inside the vehicle. White powder drifted through the windshield while a faint cloud of steam curled upward from beneath the hood. Birds lifted from the nearby oak trees all at once, startled by the noise. The horses looked up for a moment before returning to their hay. The gate barely moved. Its reinforced posts remained perfectly straight. The heavy hinges did exactly what they had been engineered to do. They held their position. I walked toward the entrance without hurrying. My boots crunched across the gravel while the smell of warm coolant mixed with cedar and fresh-cut grass. Linda climbed out of the driver's seat, looking more shocked than hurt. She stared at the front of her Mercedes, then at the gate, then back at me as though reality had somehow broken the rules instead of her assumptions. "What did you do?" she demanded. I glanced at the warning signs, the reflective tape, and the camera mounted above the entrance, its small green indicator blinking steadily. "I replaced an old gate," I answered. "You cannot do this," she said, pointing toward the entrance. "This is dangerous." I shook my head calmly. A clearly marked gate on private property is not dangerous. Ignoring it can be expensive. She reached for her phone immediately. Within minutes, an insurance representative was on speaker while she explained that a gate had damaged her vehicle. I stayed quiet. There was nothing to argue about. Every important detail had already been recorded from 4 different camera angles. Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived not long afterward, parked beside the county road, and slowly walked over to inspect the scene. He looked at the warning signs first. Then he examined the fresh concrete footings, the reinforced steel posts, and finally the security cameras that overlooked the entire entrance. He asked Linda one simple question. "Did you see the signs before you entered?" She hesitated just long enough to answer it without speaking. The silence said more than any explanation could have. The sheriff turned toward me. "Would you mind preserving today's footage?" I nodded. "Already backed up." He smiled slightly. "I thought it probably was." Linda looked from him to me and back again as though waiting for someone to declare the entire morning a misunderstanding. Instead, everyone quietly acknowledged the same fact. The gate had remained exactly where it belonged. The property line had never moved. The signs had been impossible to miss. The only thing that failed that morning was the assumption that private property could be treated like a neighborhood shortcut forever. The insurance adjuster arrived early Monday morning carrying a tablet, a measuring wheel, and the patient expression of someone who had already heard 3 different versions of the same story before finishing breakfast. The air still smelled like damp cedar from a light rain the night before, and tiny drops of water clung to the steel gate as the morning sun slowly dried the pasture. Linda stood beside her Mercedes with folded arms, insisting over and over that the entrance had been intentionally designed to damage her vehicle. I stayed quiet. Every time she spoke, she pointed at the gate. Every time I answered a question, I pointed at the warning signs, the survey markers, and the security cameras. Facts require much less energy than arguments. The adjuster began with the simplest question imaginable. "Can I see the recordings?" I invited him into my workshop where 4 synchronized camera views filled the monitor. The video played without interruption. It showed the county road, the reflective warning signs, the clearly closed gate, Linda slowing almost to a stop, her vehicle remaining in front of the entrance long enough for every sign to be visible. Then came the small increase in speed before the front bumper contacted the stationary gate. Nobody pushed anything. Nothing swung unexpectedly. Nothing malfunctioned. The gate never moved until her vehicle reached it. The adjuster replayed the footage twice before asking if he could copy the files. I handed him a flash drive containing every angle along with timestamps and backup records. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You keep thorough records." I smiled. "I maintain a ranch. Documentation saves time." Later that afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Brooks stopped by with copies of his incident report. After confirming measurements and reviewing the property survey one final time, he noted that the entrance remained entirely inside my deeded property. The warning signs complied with county visibility recommendations, and there was no evidence of obstruction extending into the public roadway. Before leaving, he glanced toward the gate and quietly said, "Most disputes become complicated because people argue about facts. This one does not seem to have that problem." Meanwhile, Linda's confidence began disappearing one phone call at a time. Her insurance company requested additional statements. The subdivision board scheduled a special meeting after several homeowners learned that unofficial shortcut traffic had been encouraged without any recorded easement or written permission from neighboring landowners. A few residents who had followed Linda across my ranch contacted me personally to apologize. They explained they honestly believed the route had been authorized because the Homeowners Association president had treated it like community property. I thanked every one of them. None of those conversations needed anger. They only needed clarity. 2 weeks later, the insurance decision arrived. Because the vehicle had entered clearly marked private property and made contact with a stationary structure after multiple visible warnings, the claim for property damage against me was denied. Even worse for Linda, portions of the repair costs fell outside her policy coverage because the investigation concluded that the incident resulted from disregarding posted restrictions rather than an unforeseen roadway hazard. The repair estimate alone exceeded $50,000. Towing, inspections, rental vehicle expenses, and additional uncovered costs pushed the total substantially higher. Then came another letter. My attorney had prepared a straightforward demand for reimbursement covering damage to the original gate that had accumulated over months of unauthorized use before its replacement. professional survey expenses, additional security installations made necessary by repeated trespassing, legal consultation fees, and restoration work around the entrance. Everything was supported by invoices, photographs, dates, and recordings. Nothing was exaggerated. Every dollar had a receipt attached to it. During mediation, Linda's attorney reviewed the evidence in silence for nearly half an hour before quietly recommending settlement discussions. By the time every expense had been calculated between the uncovered vehicle losses, legal costs, documented property claims, and related financial obligations, the total approached $68,000. Hearing that number spoken aloud inside the conference room felt strangely quiet. Months earlier, Linda believed saving 6 minutes justified ignoring a property line. Now those same decisions carried a price measured not in minutes, but in accountability. As we left the building, I noticed something that surprised me. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was simply the calm satisfaction that comes from watching careful preparation accomplish exactly what anger never could. The strongest part of the entire outcome was never the reinforced steel gate standing back at my ranch. It was the evidence patiently collected long before anyone realized how valuable it would become. About a month after everything was settled, I stood at the entrance just before sunrise with another cup of black coffee warming my hands. The air smelled like fresh cedar, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers growing along the fence line. A gentle breeze rolled across the pasture, carrying the quiet sounds that had always belonged here. Cattle moved slowly through the grass. The old windmill turned with its familiar groan. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark greeted the morning exactly the way it had long before any homeowners association ever existed. I reached for the gate and pulled it open. The reinforced hinges moved with a smooth, confident whisper before the latch settled back into place with one clean metallic click. That sound made me smile every single time. It reminded me of my grandfather standing beside this very entrance more than 50 years earlier, wiping dust from his hands after finishing the original gate. He always believed that if you built something honestly, respected other people, and kept good records, time would usually reward patience more than anger. I did not fully understand those words until this entire experience came to an end. Willow Creek Estates eventually installed new directional signs, sending residents toward the public road instead of my property. The unofficial shortcut disappeared almost overnight. Delivery drivers stopped at the county entrance like they always should have. Real estate agents updated their maps. Weekend visitors no longer wandered onto my ranch looking for scenic photographs because the confusion had finally been corrected. A few neighbors even stopped by to introduce themselves properly. Several admitted they had simply assumed the road belonged to everyone because that was how it had always been presented. We shook hands, talked about cattle prices, rainfall, and fence repairs, and then everyone went home using the public road without the slightest complaint. Respect turned out to be much easier than entitlement. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Linda resigned from the Homeowners Association presidency before the next annual election. Someone else took over, and according to the neighbors, the board meetings became a lot shorter once people focused on maintaining their own community instead of expanding it onto someone else's land. I never celebrated her resignation because that had never been my goal. My goal was much simpler. I wanted my family ranch to remain exactly what it had always been, private property cared for by the people who owned it. Looking back now, the strongest part of the story was never the reinforced gate, the security cameras, or even the settlement itself. Those were only tools. The real turning point happened the moment I stopped reacting emotionally and started preparing carefully. Every photograph mattered. Every certified letter mattered. Every receipt, every survey, every conversation written down in a notebook mattered. None of those things felt dramatic while I was collecting them, but together they became stronger than any argument ever could have been. People sometimes ask whether I built that gate hoping someone would damage their own vehicle. The answer has always been no. I built it because the old one had been repeatedly abused and no longer served the purpose my grandfather intended. A ranch gate is supposed to protect livestock, define a property line, and remind visitors that they are entering someone else's land with permission. It is never supposed to surrender simply because another person decides convenience outweighs ownership. Every improvement I made could have remained unnoticed forever if everyone had respected the signs that were already there. That was always the easiest solution. As the sun climbed higher above the oak trees, golden light reflected from the steel frame and spread across the gravel driveway stretching toward the house. Scout trotted past me before disappearing into the pasture, completely unconcerned about unexpected traffic because there was none left to worry about. The ranch sounded like home again. Quiet, honest, uncomplicated. I closed the gate one last time and listened to that solid metallic click echo across the fields. Months earlier, Linda believed that repeating the same shortcut often enough would somehow erase a property line. Instead, she discovered that boundaries do not disappear simply because someone chooses to ignore them. They become even stronger when the people protecting them stay patient, stay prepared, and let the truth speak for itself. My grandfather was right after all. Justice is not loud. It does not race down the road with flashing lights or arrive wrapped in dramatic speeches. Sometimes it sounds like nothing more than a well-built gate closing exactly where it belongs, reminding everyone who hears it that respect will always last longer than entitlement.